There are buildings that hold memories. And then there are buildings that hold something else, something that refuses to let go, that echoes through time, that burns and never quite dies. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and before we descend into one of Victorian England's most disturbing mysteries, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. The stories we uncover here are the ones history tried to forget. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Are you alone? Can you hear the wind outside? Because this story begins with wind, with fog, and with fire. Today, we're traveling to Saint Albans, England, to a grand stone orphanage that stood on the fog-covered outskirts of town, to a building that burned twice in 2 years, and to the children who may still be trapped inside its walls, calling out from the ashes for someone to hear their truth. This is the story of the fire of Saint Albans, and it's a story that has never been properly told until now. The year is 1889. England is deep in the grip of the Industrial Revolution. Cities are growing, factories are churning, and with progress comes a darker consequence: poverty, abandonment, and an overwhelming number of orphaned children with nowhere to go. In response to this crisis, philanthropic organizations and the Church of England begin establishing orphanages throughout the country. These institutions are meant to be beacons of hope, places where lost children can find shelter, education, and a path to a better life. On the outskirts of Saint Albans, Hertfordshire, construction begins on one such institution, the Saint Albans Home for Foundling Children. It is funded by a generous donation from an anonymous benefactor and designed to house up to 150 children between the ages of 4 and 16. The building is impressive. 3 stories of gray stone with tall Gothic windows, a slate roof, and a central chapel with a bell tower that can be seen from miles away. The architecture is meant to inspire, to lift the spirits of the forgotten, and remind them that they are worthy of beauty and dignity. The orphanage opens its doors in January 1890. Within months, it is filled to capacity. Children arrive from all over Hertfordshire and the surrounding counties, some abandoned at birth, others orphaned by disease or industrial accidents, a few removed from abusive homes. The staff consists of a headmistress, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, a stern but reportedly fair woman in her 50s, 6 teachers, a chaplain, Reverend Thomas Blackwood, a doctor, and a rotating staff of matrons and kitchen workers. By all accounts, it is a well-run institution. The children are fed, clothed, educated, and taught trades that will help them find work when they come of age. But from the very beginning, there are rumors. Locals who live near the orphanage begin to report strange occurrences. Lights flickering in the upper windows long after curfew. The sound of children singing hymns at 3 in the morning. And most disturbing of all, the smell of smoke, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the fog on nights when no fires are burning. These reports are dismissed as superstition. The building is old stone, drafty, and surrounded by farmland where farmers burn crop waste. The lights are explained as staff working late. The singing is chalked up to children who can't sleep. But the staff know differently. They whisper among themselves about the chapel, about how it feels wrong, about how the children refuse to pray there after dark, about how Reverend Blackwood has begun locking the chapel doors at night because he claims he hears footsteps inside when no one else is there. In September 1892, something happens that changes everything. A young matron named Sarah Mitchell is found unconscious in the chapel early one morning. When she regains consciousness, she is hysterical, unable to speak coherently. The doctor sedates her, and when she finally calms down enough to talk, she tells a story that no one wants to believe. She claims she went to the chapel the night before to retrieve a hymnal she had forgotten. When she entered, she saw figures standing in the pews. Children, she thought at first. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized They weren't children from the orphanage. They were wearing old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless, and they were all staring at the altar. She turned to run, but the chapel doors slammed shut. She pounded on them, screaming, but no one came. And then she heard a voice coming from behind the altar, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The figures in the pews began to turn toward her, their mouths opening in silent screams. That's the last thing she remembers before waking up in the infirmary. Sarah Mitchell is dismissed from her position the next day. Mrs. Ashworth tells the other staff members that Sarah had been overworked and had suffered a nervous breakdown. The matter is not to be discussed further. But 3 days later, Reverend Blackwood goes to Mrs. Ashworth with a request. He wants to seal the altar in the chapel. He won't explain why, but he insists it's necessary. Mrs. Ashworth, perhaps unnerved by Sarah's incident, agrees. Workmen are brought in. They build a wooden panel over the front of the altar, covering the stone surface completely. The panel is nailed shut, and Reverend Blackwood performs a blessing over it. When asked why this is necessary, he tells the staff it's to protect the sanctity of the space. The children are told the altar is being repaired and will be reopened soon. But it never is. For the next 6 weeks, the orphanage seems to settle. The strange occurrences stop. The children sleep through the night. The staff begin to relax, convinced that whatever had been troubling the building has been resolved. And then comes November 3rd, 1892, the night everything burns. November 3rd, 1892, is a cold, foggy evening in Saint Albans. The children of the orphanage finish their supper, say their evening prayers, and are sent to bed by 8 p.m. The older children sleep in dormitories on the 2nd floor, the younger ones on the 3rd. The staff quarters are on the 1st floor, near the kitchen and administrative offices. By 10 p.m., the building is quiet. The matrons make their final rounds, checking that all the children are asleep. Everything seems normal. At approximately 11:47 p.m., one of the matrons, a woman named Grace Hartley, wakes to the smell of smoke. She sits up, disoriented, and realizes the air in her room is thick and acrid. She opens her door and is met with a wall of heat and flames. The fire is already massive, roaring through the 1st floor with terrifying speed. Grace screams, waking the other staff members. They scramble to evacuate, but the smoke is so dense they can barely see. The wooden floors and old stone walls seem to amplify the flames rather than contain them. Mrs. Ashworth, thinking clearly despite the chaos, orders the staff to focus on evacuating the children. Several matrons and teachers rush up the stairs to the 2nd and 3rd floors, pounding on doors, dragging sleepy children out of their beds. But the fire is moving faster than anyone expected. The staircase between the 1st and 2nd floors collapses within minutes, cutting off the main escape route. The staff and children on the upper floors are trapped. Panic sets in. Children scream. Staff members desperately search for alternate routes. Some manage to break windows and lower children to the ground using bedsheets tied together. Others huddle in corners, paralyzed by fear and smoke inhalation. One of the teachers, Miss Catherine Brown, later testifies that as she was trying to evacuate children from the 2nd floor, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Over the roar of the flames and the screams of the children, she heard singing. A children's choir, singing a hymn in perfect harmony. But it wasn't coming from the children she was trying to save. It was coming from below, from the chapel. She thought she must be hallucinating from the smoke. But other survivors would later report hearing the same thing, a hymn, sung by voices that didn't belong to anyone living. By the time the local fire brigade arrives, the building is fully engulfed. They do what they can, but it's already too late. The roof collapses around midnight. The walls, though stone, crack and crumble from the intense heat. By dawn, all that remains is a smoking ruin. The death toll is staggering. 43 children and 6 staff members perished in the fire. Most died from smoke inhalation. Some were burned beyond recognition. A few died from injuries sustained jumping from windows. The survivors, 32 children and 8 staff members, are taken to local homes and churches, where they are treated for burns, smoke inhalation, and shock. An inquest is convened immediately. Fire investigators examine the ruins, trying to determine the cause. They focus on the kitchen, where a coal stove had been in use earlier that evening. The official conclusion is that embers from the stove must have ignited nearby wooden beams, and the fire spread from there. But this explanation doesn't satisfy everyone. Several survivors insist the fire didn't start in the kitchen. They claim it started in the chapel. They say they saw flames bursting through the chapel doors before any other part of the building caught fire. One survivor, a 14-year-old boy named Thomas Whitmore, gives a statement to investigators that is later stricken from the record. He claims he woke before the fire alarms and went to the window to see what had disturbed his sleep. He looked down at the chapel wing and saw something he couldn't explain: figures moving inside, visible through the windows. Figures surrounded by flames, but not burning. And in the center of the chapel, the sealed altar was glowing with an orange light that didn't look like fire. It looked, he said, like something alive. The investigators dismiss his testimony as the confused recollections of a traumatized child. The official cause remains accidental fire, origin in the kitchen. But there's one detail the investigators can't explain. When they sift through the ruins of the chapel, they find the wooden panel that had been covering the altar. It's intact, unburned, lying on the ground several feet away from where it should have been, as if it had been removed and carefully set aside before the fire began. Reverend Blackwood, who survived the fire with minor injuries, is questioned about this. He has no explanation. Or rather, he refuses to give one. When pressed, he resigns from his position and leaves Saint Albans within the week. He never speaks publicly about the fire again. In the aftermath of the fire, the community of Saint Albans is devastated. A mass funeral is held for the victims, and they are buried in a section of the local cemetery that will come to be known as the Children's Garden. Simple white headstones mark each grave, most bearing only a first name and the date, November 3, 1892. The surviving children are dispersed to other institutions throughout England. Many of them carry the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. Several, according to records, end up in asylums, unable to cope with what they experienced. Others disappear into the working class, their stories lost to history. The orphanage property is left abandoned. The ruins stand as a grim reminder of the tragedy, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Locals avoid the site, claiming it feels wrong, that the air is heavy there, that you can still smell smoke even on clear days. But then, in 1894, something unexpected happens. The anonymous benefactor who originally funded the orphanage comes forward with another donation. They want to rebuild. They want to honor the children who died by creating a new, safer institution on the same site. There is significant opposition. Many in the community believe the site should be left as a memorial. Others are superstitious, believing the ground itself is cursed. But the benefactor is persuasive, and they have the support of the church. Construction begins in the spring of 1894. The new building is designed with safety in mind. Stone construction throughout, multiple staircases, fire-resistant materials, wide doors, and notably, no chapel. Instead, a small prayer room is included on the first floor, easily accessible and far from any potential fire hazards. The new Saint Albans home for foundling children opens in October 1894. It is smaller than the original, housing only 80 children. The staff is carefully selected and strict fire safety protocols are put in place. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, who survived the first fire, returns as headmistress, determined to ensure nothing like that tragedy ever happens again. For the first few weeks, everything is fine. The children settle in. Lessons resume. Life slowly begins to feel normal again. But then the reports start. Children complaining of nightmares, always the same dream. They're standing in a chapel, surrounded by other children, and they're singing a hymn they don't recognize. And as they sing, the walls begin to glow and heat builds around them, but they can't stop singing. They can't move. They can only watch as the flames come closer. Staff members report feeling watched in certain parts of the building, particularly near the prayer room. Some claim to hear footsteps in the halls late at night, the sound of children's voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. Mrs. Ashworth dismisses these reports as residual trauma. The children, she insists, are remembering the fire. The staff are on edge because of what happened. It's all perfectly explainable. On the night of December 21st, 1894, the winter solstice, the new orphanage catches fire. It happens just after midnight. A night watchman, hired specifically to prevent such a disaster, is found unconscious outside the building by a passing constable. When he's revived, he can't explain what happened. He remembers making his rounds, checking the prayer room, and then ... nothing. He woke up on the ground, and the building was burning. This fire spreads even faster than the first. Despite all the safety precautions, despite the fire-resistant construction, the building is engulfed within minutes. The stone walls crack from the heat. The roof collapses. The multiple staircases don't help. The smoke is so thick and the fire so intense that evacuation is nearly impossible. This time, the death toll is even worse. 51 children and 12 staff members perish. Mrs. Ashworth is among the dead, found in the prayer room. Her body positioned as if she had been kneeling in prayer when the flames took her. Survivors fewer than 20 are evacuated to a nearby church. Many are badly burned. All are in shock. And all of them, when questioned, tell the same impossible story. They say the fire started in the prayer room. They say they saw light coming from under the door before any smoke appeared. And they say that just before they fled, they heard the singing. A children's choir, dozens of voices singing a hymn in perfect harmony. But there were no children in the prayer room. It had been empty. The second fire destroys any remaining will to rebuild. The property is abandoned permanently. The ruins are left to decay, and within a decade, they are barely recognizable as having been a building at all. But the story doesn't end there. Because the fires, it turns out, were only the beginning. In the years following the second fire, Saint Albans experiences a series of unexplained incidents. Houses near the former orphanage site report spontaneous fires, small, contained, but occurring with disturbing frequency. Firefighters respond dozens of times over the next decade, always to the same area, always finding fires that seem to have started from nowhere. And then there are the sightings. Locals begin reporting seeing children near the ruins, always at night, always in old-fashioned clothing, standing in groups as if waiting for something, and then vanishing when approached. One particularly detailed account comes from a farmer named Robert Hayes, whose property bordered the orphanage land. In a letter to the local newspaper in 1902, he describes waking one night to the sound of singing. He went to his window and saw, in the ruins of the orphanage, what he estimated to be 50 or 60 children standing in the moonlight, arranged in rows as if in a choir. They were singing a hymn he didn't recognize, and as they sang, the ruins around them began to glow with a faint orange light. He watched for several minutes, too frightened to move. And then, all at once, the children stopped singing, turned as one to face his house, and vanished. Robert Hayes sold his property and moved away within the month. Similar reports continue throughout the early 1900s, the local church attempts several blessings and exorcisms of the site, but none seem to have any lasting effect. Eventually, the community simply learns to avoid the area. Parents warn their children not to play near the ruins. Travelers are advised to take alternate routes at night. By the 1920s, the story of the Saint Albans orphanage fires has faded into local legend. Most people assume it's just a ghost story, an urban legend with no real basis in fact. But then, in 1967, a historian named Dr. Margaret Ashford begins researching Victorian-era orphanages for a book she's writing. She comes across references to the St. Albans fires and decides to investigate further. She discovers raises more questions than it answers. Dr. Ashford tracks down descendants of some of the survivors and manages to obtain private journals and letters that were never part of the official record. In these documents, she finds consistent testimony about strange occurrences in the original orphanage long before the first fire. Children reporting nightmares, staff members hearing voices, and most significantly, Reverend Blackwood's own notes, preserved by his family, describing what he found beneath the altar. According to Blackwood's notes, during renovations in 1892, workers discovered that the chapel had been built on top of an older structure. When they lifted one of the altar stones to repair it, they found a chamber beneath. Inside the chamber were human remains, dozens of skeletons, many of them small. Children's bones. Blackwood immediately ordered the chamber sealed. He didn't report the discovery to authorities. He didn't conduct a proper burial. He simply had the altar covered and locked the chapel, hoping that would be enough. Dr. Ashford also finds a reference in parish records from the 1600s describing a house of correction that once stood on the same site, an institution where unruly or orphaned children were sent to be reformed through prayer and discipline. The records mention that many children died there due to harsh conditions and disease, and that they were buried on the grounds. The chapel of the 1890s orphanage, it seems, had been built directly over a mass grave of children who died in suffering and neglect centuries before. Dr. Ashford publishes her findings in a 1969 academic journal. The article is largely ignored by mainstream historians, but gains attention in paranormal circles. It suggests that the fires at Saint Albans were not accidents or arson, but something else, a manifestation of unresolved trauma and suffering. Trapped in the land itself. In 1975, the Saint Albans City Council finally takes action. The ruins are demolished, and the land is excavated. Archaeological teams find exactly what Blackwood described, a large chamber filled with human remains. Over 120 skeletons, most of them children between the ages of 5 and 15. Dating back to the 17th century, the remains are carefully removed and given a proper burial in the local cemetery, next to the victims of the 1892 and 1894 fires. A memorial is erected, a simple stone marker that reads, "In memory of all the children of St. Albans. May they finally rest in peace." The memorial seems to help. After the burial, the reports of fires and sightings in the area decrease significantly. The land is eventually sold and developed into a small residential neighborhood in the 1980s. Families move in, unaware of the history beneath their homes, but some residents report strange experiences. Children talk about imaginary friends who only appear at night. Families hear singing late at night when no radios or TVs are on, and a few report waking in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke, only to find no source. In 2003, a family living on what would have been the site of the chapel has a terrifying experience. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, begins sleepwalking. She walks to the same spot in their backyard every night, stands there for several minutes, and then returns to bed, never waking. When her parents ask her about it in the morning, she has no memory of it. This continues for 3 weeks. And then, one night, Emma's mother follows her. She watches as Emma walks to the spot, stops, and begins to sing. It's a hymn, sung in a clear, beautiful voice that doesn't sound quite like Emma's own. And as she sings, other voices join in children's voices, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, harmonizing perfectly. Emma's mother is so frightened, she grabs her daughter and carries her back inside. She and her husband list the house for sale the next day. They move before the month is over. The new owners experience nothing unusual, but the house after that does, and the one after that. It seems the phenomena are selective, affecting some families, but not others, particularly those with young children. By 2010, the neighborhood has gained a reputation. Real estate agents have difficulty selling homes in certain sections. Property values drop. Some houses sit empty for years. In 2015, a paranormal investigation team gains permission to spend a night in one of the affected homes. They set up cameras, audio recorders, and various other equipment. What they capture becomes one of the most compelling pieces of paranormal evidence in recent British history. At 11:47 p.m., the exact time the first fire was reported in 1892, all their equipment registers a massive spike in electromagnetic activity. Their thermal cameras show dozens of small heat signatures appearing in the backyard, arranged in a pattern consistent with rows of children standing in formation. And their audio equipment captures what sounds unmistakably like a children's choir, singing a hymn in Latin. The investigators are experienced and skeptical by nature, but what they experienced that night shakes them. One of them, a former police officer named David Walsh, later says in an interview, "I've investigated hundreds of supposedly haunted locations. Most have simple explanations. But what we encountered in Saint Albans. There's no rational explanation for what we recorded. Those were children's voices. Real voices. And they were asking for help. The investigation footage is posted online and goes viral. Suddenly, Saint Albans becomes a destination for ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts from around the world. The local community is not pleased. They've spent decades trying to move past the tragedy, and now it's being dredged up again for entertainment. In response, the Saint Albans Historical Society begins working to properly document and honor the history of the orphanage and the children who died there. They collect survivor testimonies, preserve records, and create an online archive. They also establish an annual memorial service on November 3rd, inviting descendants of victims and survivors to gather. And remember, I attended one of these services in 2023. It was a cold, foggy evening, appropriate, given the story. About 50 people gathered at the memorial stone in the cemetery. Candles were lit, names were read, and hymns were sung. And as we sang, I felt something I can't quite explain. A presence. Not threatening, but attentive. As if we were being watched by dozens of invisible observers, listening carefully to make sure their names were spoken, their stories told, their existence acknowledged. When the service ended and people began to leave, I stayed behind for a few minutes. I stood in front of the memorial stone, looking at the names carved into its surface. 43 from 1892, 51 from 1894, and over 100 from the centuries before, now finally counted and remembered. And I heard it. Faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Singing. Children's voices, distant and echoing, as if coming from very far away. I looked around. No one else was near. No cars, no houses with open windows. Just me, the memorial, and the sound of a choir that shouldn't exist. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it faded, and the cemetery was silent again. The story of the Saint Albans fires is not a simple haunting. It's not just about ghosts or unexplained phenomena. It's about something deeper, about trauma that refuses to be buried, about suffering that echoes through time, about children who died frightened and alone, and who may, in some way we don't understand, still be reaching out. The official records say the fires were accidents. Investigations found no evidence of arson or negligence. But the survivors knew differently. They knew the fire started in the chapel. They knew something was wrong with that building from the very beginning. And they knew that what happened in 1892 and 1894 was not random, not accidental, but somehow connected to what had been buried beneath. Modern paranormal researchers have theories. Some believe the site holds residual energy, that traumatic events can imprint themselves on a location and replay, like a recording under certain conditions. Others believe the spirits of the children who died centuries ago in the house of correction were awakened when the orphanage was built on their graves, and that they reached out in the only way they could through fire, through singing, through manifestations meant to be noticed. Still others believe something darker, that the children buried beneath the chapel were not just victims of neglect, but of something more sinister, that the house of correction was a place where terrible things happened, things that were never recorded, never prosecuted, never acknowledged, and that the souls of those children are not resting because justice was never served. We'll likely never know the full truth. Too much time has passed. Too many records have been lost or destroyed. Too many witnesses have died without telling their stories. But what we do know is this: the children of Saint Albans are not forgotten. Their names are carved in stone. Their stories are preserved in archives. And on cold, foggy nights in November, if you stand in the cemetery where they're buried and listen carefully, you might hear them singing. Not in anger, not in sorrow, but in hope. Hope that someone will remember them. Hope that their suffering will be acknowledged. Hope that they will finally, after all these years, be allowed to rest. This has been the story of the Saint Albans fires, a tragedy that happened over a century ago, but whose echoes still reach us today. A reminder that the past is never truly past, and that the dead sometimes refuse to stay silent. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Case Files. I know it's been a difficult journey, but these are the stories that need to be told. These are the voices that deserve to be heard. If you made it through this entire episode, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this story. Help ensure that the children of Saint Albans are never forgotten again. Leave a comment and tell me, do you believe places can hold memories? Do you think the phenomena reported at Saint Albans are real, or just trauma and imagination? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? And if you ever find yourself in Saint Albans, stop by the cemetery. Visit the memorial. Say the names carved in stone. Light a candle if you can, because those children deserve to be remembered, not as ghosts, not as a horror story, but as the real children they were, frightened, suffering, and desperately hoping that someone, someday, would care enough to listen. Rest in peace, children of Saint Albans. Your voices have been heard. Your names are known, and you will not be forgotten. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, the most important stories are often the ones that history tried to erase. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and the fire of Saint Albans may have gone out long ago, but its light still reaches us through the darkness.